Okay, good morning. Thank you all for all the students for coming to this panel session. This is session number 2. We were going to examine the experience of migrating north, the history and the nature of Mexican immigration to the United States, and its effect on social and political life on both sides of the border. So here with me we have Pierrette Hondagneu-Sotelo. Pierrette is professor of sociology at the University of Southern California. Her past research has focused on the intersection of gender and Mexican undocumented immigration and settlement, transnational families and the changing meanings of family life, and the informal sector, particularly the realm of paid domestic work. Her book, Domestica, Immigrant Workers Cleaning and Caring in the Shadows of Affluence, which was published in 2001, won 6 awards, including the 2001 C. Grites Mill Award from the Society for the Studies of Social Problems. More recently, her research has examined how Muslim, Christians, and Jewish activists use religion to advocate for immigrant rights. Also in the panel with me is Luis Fraga. Luis Fraga is Associate Vice Provost for Faculty Advancement and is Director of Diversity Research Institute at the Russell Stark University, Professor and Professor of Political Science at the University of Washington. He is co-author of the recently published Multi-Ethnic Moments, The Politics of Urban Education Reform. This was published by Temple University Press in 2006. He also is one of the 6 principal investigators for the Latino National Survey. The Latino National Survey is the most extensive state stratified survey for Latinos living in the United States. And finally, we have Gary Segura. Gary is the professor of political science and adjunct professor for American ethnic studies at the University of Washington. He was, with Luis Fraga and other scholars, the principal investigator for the Latino National Survey, the national poll for 8,600 Latino residents of the United States, which was conducted in the fall and winter of 2005-2006. Among other scholarly outlets, his work has been published in American Political Science Review, American Journal of Political Science, and the Journal of Politics. And his work has been funded on 5 occasions by the National Science Foundation. So I really got to welcome them, and let's get started.
Thank you to all of you. Thank you to the organizers for putting together this very impressive event, and thank you to all of the attendees. It's my pleasure and honor to be here being part of this scholarly and civic engaged discussion that's, I think, so important to finding solutions to the problems we may be facing. We're riding the crest of multiple waves of immigration, as our first panel, I think, put it for us very well this morning. There are about 200 million people in the world living and working in countries other than where they were born. So we know migration is global. We know it's extraordinarily diverse and complex and changing, as our earlier speakers pointed out. This morning, I'll be restricting my comments to the topic of Mexican immigration, which weighs so heavily on U.S. and I would argue binational solutions to improving our immigration system. Certainly a lot of concern, a good deal of our U.S. debates about immigration focus on Mexican immigration, with many people contending that Mexican immigration represents a social problem of proportions we haven't seen before. I think we could also suggest that Mexican immigration presents a promise and perhaps a challenge for bettering all of our futures. So I'm not going to answer that question for you, promise or problem, but instead I'm going to offer you 10, I think, truths about Mexican immigration. The debate about Mexican immigration is so complex, in part because there's so many myths swirling around these debates, a lot of myths and misunderstandings and historical amnesia about our shared histories. So I want to try to go over these in my comments. So I have a simple presentation of these 10 points. These I will offer as 10 truths. I'm going to start with kind of a macro, long-term historical view, and then I want to move to a slightly more micro focus, the subjective experiences of people trying to negotiate kind of a dramatic fashion, this drama of migration. So my first point is this. Mexican immigration to the United States is the longest-running labor migration anywhere in the world. I think it bears repeating. Mexican migration is the longest-running labor migration anywhere in the world. So this is not just dropped from the sky overnight. And there are, as I think Professor Mark Miller went over this morning too, distinctive eras to this migration that deserve to be acknowledged. And I think it's very basic, very elementary, but we should never lose sight that Mexican origin communities in the southwestern part of the United States predate Anglo-American settlements in the United States. So if you go to California, where I live, you'll see the names of streets and cities and rivers are all in Spanish. Stanford University is in Palo Alto, tall tree, Palos Verdes, Los Angeles, etc., etc. At the conclusion of the Mexican-American War in 1848, there were about 100,000 Mexicans living in what became the United States. And then this was followed by several very distinctive patterns of Mexican labor migration, by the migration of people looking for work as laborers. And these were pretty modest levels of Mexican migration up until, we could say 1917, or we could say 1942, but I think they still deserve to be recognized because they kind of set the stage for the current era and what follows. In the 1880s, the railroads expand from the United States into Mexico City. So Ciudad Juarez, Mexico City, get connected with points of destination northward. This is the period of Porfirio Diaz in Mexico, who modernizes Mexico, invites foreign investors, and importantly builds this concrete infrastructure for transporting workers. These railroads connected Mexican workers to agricultural fields and to building railroads in the Southwest and eventually Chicago. This was the era of the enganchadores. A gancho in Spanish is basically a hook. And these were labor recruiters who went to the interior of Mexico to hook and recruit workers to come north to work in expanding primary industries largely. Labor recruiters who went directly to recruit Mexican peasant workers. The period of 1910 to the 1920s is a little different. This is the period of the Mexican Revolution. Very disruptive, families fleeing economic, political violence. And so you get a migration of entire families, not just men, not just male workers who are recruited to come northward to work in the fields, but entire families, some of them of means, shop owners, merchants, people of means who could afford to move their families, coming to places like Texas, California, Arizona. And there's also this growing job demand. I mean, the Southwest is developing in this era. Again, mining, agriculture, railroads, and it's Mexican workers doing this work in the Southwest. And increasingly you see some of them moving and settling down as pioneers in places like Kansas, Chicago, Illinois, Colorado. With the Great Depression, depression, we get the euphemistically titled repatriation program, a program of massive deportation that was referred to also in a program this morning. This was a really ugly period of nativist attacks on Mexicans who were scapegoated for joblessness and for living off of public relief. A lot of the entire climate, the dominant narratives that we hear, the ways immigration was being framed are certainly echo with what we've seen in the 80s, 90s, and up until the present. This repatriation program resulted in about 1 million people being deported, including Mexicans who were U.S. citizens, Mexican Americans who were U.S. citizens. So Mexican population declines quite, dramatically then in the 1930s. And then, of course, as the United States enters World War II, there's a problem, once again, of a labor shortage. This time, the problem is how to fuel labor in the fields and industries with so many servicemen going abroad. So the solution then is a formalized, much larger bracero program. Bracero refers to arms, basically working arms, a program to bring so-called temporary contracted workers. This was really pushed for by the Western agricultural lobbyists, growing agribusiness in in Texas and in California, who needed a labor force in the fields. Consequently, and there were many different contracts negotiated, bilateral contracts negotiated between the United States and Mexico, but over this period, which lasted, as you know, World War II ended well before 1964, but the program was in effect from 1942 to 1964, went through many different eras. But over this period, over 5 million contracts were issued to largely Mexican men for temporary contracted work. And again, this was a program that recruited primarily men, not families, not women, and primarily to work in rural agricultural areas of the United States. So it was, I think, to the national eye, a labor that remained highly invisible, right? It was not Mexicans settling down in cities and in suburbs. And it was a migration that had a circular nature to it, circular sojourner, itinerant nature to it, with workers coming to work in the harvest and returning to Mexico when their contracts were up. And of course, there were millions, of course, as the contracts got harder to get, millions, of course, who worked outside of contracted labor, and many, many employers who were willing to hire these workers. That, in fact, is why LBJ pushed for the Texas Proviso. He was responding to the interest of agricultural workers. So I can't overemphasize, I think, the importance of the bracero program, similar to the importance of the guest worker programs in Europe after the war. The importance of these in really manufacturing the foundations for the immigration that is to come in subsequent decades. The bracero program really sowed the seeds for today's Mexican immigration, and similarly patterns in guest worker programs in Europe. All right, so that brings us, bracero program ends in 1964. And from 1965 on up through the 80s, on up till today, we see a growing number of Mexican migrant workers coming to the United States as undocumented, unauthorized, unpapered, illegal workers, whatever term you wish to use. And we see, importantly, the diversification of Mexican immigrant settlement and labor force incorporation into cities and suburbs, out of the fields and into much more highly visible cities and suburbs, integrated economically into just about every sector of the U.S. economy. So Beginning, in the 1960s, 1970s through the 80s, you see this rapid increase in Mexican immigrant population, both legal and illegal. And the way this happened is interesting. It goes back to the Bracero program. Many of these braceros were able to legalize their status through the assistance of their employers who didn't want them going home all the time and disrupting production, but wanted a steady, constant labor force. As these braceros got their green cards and became legal permanent residents, they were able to bring their families with them. Often this was a very contentious process in families between wives and husbands and parents and children. But as these families migrated to California, some worked in the fields, but some of the men came out of the fields and got jobs in cities and in suburbs, in construction, in packing houses, in shops. And you begin to see this diversification into manufacturing, packing houses, construction, services of all kinds, hotels, restaurants, private services in homes. So this is a real kind of seismic shift in the character of Mexican immigration, right, going from the Bracero program up through the post-60s period. This leads us up, then we see in the 1970s, really beginning in the Carter administration, continuing through the 1980s, a lot of concern about Mexican immigrants in the United States. And we begin to see, talk of a tortilla curtain, I think in 1977 or so. And then these various proposals for imposing regulations at the workplace, for doing away with this Texas proviso. And so that's when we begin to see the Simpson, Mazzoli, the Simpson-Rodino bills. It took so long to push through and through the Beltway. Finally, President Reagan in November of 1986 signed the Immigration Reform and Control Act, which we refer to as IRCA, shorthand. And it was basically a two-pronged strategy, the result of this horse trading in Washington. The centerpiece of it had always been employer sanctions. Let's impose fines and actually criminalize and put penalties on employers who knowingly hire unauthorized, undocumented immigrant workers. And then other opponents of this had managed to say, well, what are we going to do about the millions of people who are already working here and raising their families and contributing to industry and the economy as unauthorized workers? And that's where we got this amnesty legalization program, of which there were several different components. But basically, it's important for you to know that this was not just, it's a massive giveaway, right? Anybody who wants, here, we're handing out U.S. citizenship. It did not go like this. People had to prove that they had been residing in the United States as undocumented workers for a period of 5 years continuously without criminal records, without having become dependent on welfare or any kinds of other public services. And there was a special provision, the SAWS, the Seasonal Agricultural Workers Program, for those who had worked harvesting and could show that they had been harvesting in the fields. I was working in grassroots organizations on the ground as people came out of the shadows in a place called Redwood City, California, when this happened. And it was really a sort of a massive, it provoked massive civic engagement, is what I want to emphasize. There was a lot of fear and urgency around this, but it was also very impressive kind of response on the ground among a lot of nonprofit organizations and churches in particular. So that was IRCA. The 1986 IRCA resulted in employer sanctions, which proved to be very hard, as the former Secretary of Labor Ray Marshall emphasized last night, proved to be very difficult to implement. But the amnesty legalization program, which had been this sort of add-on, did have this echo to it, with over 2 million Mexicans getting legalized in the 1980s, out of a total of about 3 million, the vast majority of whom were Mexican, most of them in California. So this had provoked two big consequences. One is that it flooded the labor markets of California and Texas with newly legalized workers. This gave people the freedom of movement. People who had been working as undocumented workers and who had previously felt perhaps yoked to particular jobs, or who felt that they really couldn't, afford to look elsewhere or complain about, couldn't exit, right? These jobs were now free to move and perhaps look for a better job without fear of detection. And secondarily, and that happened both occupationally and spatially, as I'll go into in a moment. Secondly, newly legalized people could apply for naturalization within 5 years. So again, I want to emphasize that the way amnesty legalization happened was not this free-for-all. It was this very regulated program that allowed people to become, you could call it denizens or legal permanent residents. And then within 5 years, they could, if they passed citizenship tests and so on and learned English, could apply for citizenship, as many did. We did have this little burgeoning naturalization move among Mexicans in the 1990s, and that then meant that they could legally sponsor close family relatives, regardless of whether the quotas allowed them to arrive quickly. Okay, so that was my first point. I'm still on my point number one. I think I better go a little quicker. But it was just kind of a thumbnail sketch of what's come before. My second point, my second truth I want to say, is that Mexican immigration to the United States is rooted in structural conditions and exchanges. Yes, the United States and Mexico are separate sovereign nations, but it's important to recognize that not only do we share a 2,000-mile border, but we share long, deep, and continuous, increasingly intimate economic, political, and social ties. So not only has Mexican immigration been, assembled over this pattern, over this history, but there's, as has been alluded to with NAFTA, there are these massive commercial exchanges and business exchanges between the United States and Mexico. Hundreds of billions of dollars going back and forth, trade, tourism, business, scientific, technical exchanges. So it is really important, I think, to respect our sovereignty of both nations, but to understand that Mexico and the U.S., and we could include Canada, and we could include Central America, is a particular economic region within the particular world system, with many ties bringing us together. Okay, my third point is that today we're witnessing new destinations of an old immigration. In the 1980s and 90s, and I'm probably preaching to the choir here in North Carolina, since you've been experiencing this transition, Mexican immigrants began arriving rapidly and massively in new localities where they had not gone to in great numbers previously. So this includes Midwestern states like Iowa, Nebraska, Minnesota, Kansas, Utah, closer to the Southwest, Arkansas, New York City, which had always been an immigrant city, but not one where Mexicans were, going to. All of a sudden, had populations coming from Mexico, and particularly Puebla, Mexico. In the Southeast, all of a sudden, Georgia and Florida and North Carolina, Kentucky, Tennessee began receiving Mexicans, and I think increasingly also Central American immigrants. So the percentage of Mexicans going and staying in the old states like California and Texas has declined, and Mexicans are now going everywhere. I think we'd probably be hard-pressed to find one state where there aren't Mexicans. Mexicans are in Hawaii and Alaska. Certainly Alaska has lots of labor opportunities. So big increase in the non-traditional gateway states in Mexican immigration. Why? So here's my fourth point. What caused these new destinations to emerge? Why have Mexicans all of a sudden decided they would like to go to Kentucky and North Carolina and Tennessee? Well, I think it's very complex, but I'm going to offer at least 4 reasons that help explain this, 4 factors that help explain this. One is that we've seen, beginning under the regime of President Clinton and then Attorney General Janet Reno, a lot of resources put to militarized enforcement at the U.S.-Mexico border. This has increased the costs, the risks, and the dangers to human life in crossing in the familiar crossing points. Few people now venture to cross in the San Diego-Tijuana area as they did prior to the enforcement of border walls there. People go elsewhere. They go to the mountains and to the deserts. And as you know, this is very dangerous, right? People are dying of hypothermia and dehydration. And once they get into the U.S., people fear returning home. If they don't have the papers to make it back in, or perhaps if they arrived on a visa that expired, a tourist visa, let's say, or temporary visa of some sort, they fear returning home. So undocumented workers are trapped in the United States, and the border has sort of shifted them to go elsewhere. New crossing points have led to new points of destination. And as I alluded to earlier, secondarily, the new destinations also reflect the freedom of mobility that newly legalized, that legal permanent residents felt. After 3 million people got legalized, they also felt freer not only to leave their bad jobs, but to leave California and Texas and, seek out new horizons in Utah, for example. Thirdly, I think they're responding also to deteriorating job possibilities in California, particularly in the 1990s. And I think this is, our labor markets are segmented. Mexican immigrants are not working in all jobs, and it's similarly gendered. And I believe that labor markets for men have been particularly more saturated in places like California. And so Mexicans have responded to new labor demand in the meat packing plants of Kansas, and the furniture manufacturing, carpet manufacturing, and certainly hotels and restaurants and private services, and probably in services at this university. And fourthly, I think people have gone elsewhere because they were responding to a increasingly hostile climate of reception in California in the 1990s, not only where we had Proposition 187, the brainchild of then Pete Wilson, aimed at really the support services for children, for women and children. And also families, Mexican families, were responding to the high cost of living in places like California and trying to escape dangerous neighborhoods that they were forced to live in places like Los Angeles or San Jose. It sounds cliche, but many Mexican immigrant families are very family-oriented and are looking, for safe, sane places to raise their children. And I think that's part of what's behind the seeking out of new destinations also. My fifth point, I'll go quicker, I'm not sure. Yes, I'll go very quick. Social networks are the glue that make immigration possible. So these are webs of social ties among families and friends. It means that wherever Mexican immigrants have settled, their friends and families will likely be arriving. The number of Mexican immigrants reached about 10 million in the U.S. A few years ago, a big symbolic threshold. My seventh point, the current immigration law system does not seem to be working, especially does not seem to be working for particular groups of immigrants, particular nationalities, Mexicans especially. And as our immigration lawyer who spoke last night from the audience noted, this is largely has to do with the number of visas, the number of visas that are made available every year. We could change the numbers of undocumented workers pretty quickly by increasing the quotas for legal permanent residents. My eighth point I want to hammer home just a little bit, and that is that although we are witnessing a lot of populist anti-immigrant sentiment in the United States, I believe a lot of this is pretty surface and drummed up by campaigns and talk radio. I think what many Americans don't know is that there are many sectors of the American population that are working pretty diligently for the integration of Mexican immigrants and other immigrants into U.S. Society. This includes the traditional ethnic organizations like MALDEF or La Raza. It includes labor unions that I'm happy to talk about later. And it includes, importantly, many sectors of religious Americans, and not just the Catholic Church, but also many people working from mainline churches. I'm happy to talk. I don't want to take more time, so I'll go a little quickly. And my ninth point, and I guess I don't have much time to go on this either, is that the vast majority of Mexican immigrants are really hard-working, law-abiding, and self-sacrificing. And there are many heroic efforts underway on the ground. Many, I think, even been a lot of concern and debates about Mexican immigrants having low human capital, low levels of schooling. And I'm happy to talk to you about how some of these people are negotiating their lives and building lives for their families in the United States. And my 10th point I want to, I'll say very quickly, is that fear and distrust has greeted prior immigrant groups, Germans, Irish, Italians, in previous periods, and yet they have prevailed. And Mexican immigrants today really do want to be part of U.S. society. We're witnessing today, I think, a massive citizenship movement. So the marches you saw in the streets in the spring of 2006 were not massive protests against the society, but were really kind of a massive call, let us participate. There's a massive movement. For years, naturalization rates were very low among Mexican immigrants. It was highly stigmatized to become a U.S. citizen, and today that has changed quite radically. Thank you for your time.
Thank you so much, Pierrette. So it's your turn.
Hi, I'm Luis Fraga. My colleague and dear friend Gary Segura and I are each going to take about 15 minutes to address some issues that we want to address. And we're going to use some PowerPoint slides. So if you wear bifocals like I do, you may want to reposition yourself so that you're able to see the slides effectively. The slide behind me of the protests that were just mentioned in Los Angeles were not predicted by anyone. This is a picture of downtown Los Angeles and City Hall on May 1st of 2006, with about 500,000 people on the streets of LA. Many with American flags, many wearing white t-shirts, many with flags of different countries. They're protesting against House Resolution 4437 that would make that proposed to make a felony being of undocumented status. No one predicted this. Is this a sign of strength in the United States, of civic culture and civil society, or is this a sign of perpetual threat? Who were these folks? Who were these folks who were on the street, and what implication does that sort of protest have? To try to address these two questions, I think important questions, Gary and I are going to try to make 5 points. First, the politics of U.S. immigration policy has always been tied to visions of American national identity. It's impossible to separate out the politics of immigration from the politics of defining who we are as a country, who we are as a nation. Second, the controversy over that vision of what American national identity is and who an American is centrally and intimately tied to the role of racial and ethnic groups in the United States. A friend of mine, Richard Alba from the State University of New York at Albany, uses the term immigrant-derived ethnic groups. I think it's an interesting way and a useful way to try to think of some of the additional complexities that Mexican immigration brings to the United States. Third, social indicators suggest a more rapid and effective absorption of Latino immigrants, and including Mexican immigrants, than much popular opinion would indicate. And Gary's going to talk about some data that we have from our Latino National Survey to address that. Fourth, globalization, something you've heard already. Globalization and free trade regimes have important economic implications at home and abroad that place new demands on the United States, not just to define its interests, but I would suggest to define its national identity within this new changing international environment. And then finally, we want to point to a number of important political implications on how we're going to address immigration in the coming years. Why now? Why is this such a big issue now? The graph behind me gives us one way of beginning to understand this. This is a graph, I know it's hard to read, that tracks the number of immigrants to the United States as best records are kept. And this is largely of documented immigrants. It doesn't include the undocumented population, depending on how one wants to understand from census-based data the accuracy of counting documented individuals and the response rates. This suggests that in the period of 2000, the last point, if you will, on the far right-hand side of the graph, we're getting a new convergence. We're getting a percent of the American population that is foreign-born that is approaching, if not now, has actually surpassed, as best we know from historical records, the percent that the American population has ever been of foreign-born. So we're beginning to approach our historical maximum, if you will. Don't misunderstand me. I'm not suggesting that that's a historical maximum that we can't overcome. I'm just suggesting within the history of the United States, that's extremely important. And the numbers are big. The numbers are much bigger than they have ever been, estimated at about 30 million. That's one reason. Second, since our immigration reform laws in 1965 and the elimination of country-based quotas, where people are coming from has changed dramatically, as the slide behind me indicates as well. A difficult slide to read, but what's most important is that you can see a tremendous decline in the percent of legal immigrants coming to the United States who are coming from European countries, and a tremendous increase in the number of immigrants coming from other Western Hemisphere, largely Mexico, although including other countries in the Western Hemisphere, and Asia as well. If you will, the complexion of the individuals who are coming are noticeably distinct. Now, concerns raised regarding what the integrative capacity is of the American state, concerns raised regarding national identity and what American national identity is, concerns about who these people are and whether or not they can integrate into American society. It precedes, one might argue, the American nation state itself. The quote that you see behind me is a quote from Benjamin Franklin that he wrote in 1751. When was the revolution? 1776. In the colonial era in 1751, Benjamin Franklin wrote. You can read that if you can see it. If not, let me just read very briefly from the second half of what he said. He was expressing concern about the immigrants coming to America. He said in part, why should Pennsylvania, founded by the English, become a colony of aliens, his word, who will shortly be so numerous as to Germanize us? He was concerned with the Germans. Instead of our Anglifying them, and will never adopt our language, our customs, any more than they can acquire our complexion. Notice how similar from 1751 this concern is. He also refers to the swarthy Swedes in this essay that he wrote. I wasn't sure that Swedes were swarthy, but I'm sure he had a reason to say that. Well, immigration, as you know and as you've heard already, is an intimate part, and concern about immigration, and again, issues of national identity and concern about who these immigrants are is as old as our country itself. You've had wonderful explanations as to elements of this history. Let me make just one additional point here. Our immigration law changed dramatically in 1917 and especially in 1924. This has been mentioned already. But what has not been mentioned is that undocumented status, legally, being a deportable offense, did not occur until 1917, when, and I'm taking this from the wonderful historical work of May Nye, historian who wrote the book Impossible Subjects, who makes this point in a wonderful description of the history of attitudes and especially our laws regarding immigrants. It was not until 1917 that being here without documents, absent evidence of treason, absent commission of a crime, that anyone could be deported. So just your status, your legal status. Prior to that time, now remember, prior to 1917, you could not be deported. It was not the custom in the United States for people to be deported. During earlier waves of massive immigration, the issue of being undocumented and that being deported was not one that came up because the law did not require that. We had a 5-year statute of limitations established in 1917. If you were here for 5 years, then you could not be deported just because of your undocumented status. You had a property right claim to stay here. That changed in 1924. Our 1924 law said if you're undocumented, you can immediately be deported. That sets the context for the legal regime in which we come to understand and redefine what is American, what is American national identity, and especially who is American and who has a right to try to become American. Well, what does this help us do, or how can we try to come to use this change in law as a way to better understand some elements of the current context in which we exist? One way to do it, I want to suggest to you that I don't think we've talked about quite sufficiently so far, and I hope we have a chance to discuss it more, is that this moment in history provides us an opportunity to rethink how we've always come to understand who we are as a country and who we are as a nation. And to do that, I think, we have to begin to engage in a discussion about what is the American creed. Let me provide you, and by the American creed, I mean the basic set of values and beliefs that define who we are as a people. What do we come to understand as essential to the American creed? One explanation, or one dimension, one way of understanding it that was recently re-articulated by former professor of mine, Sam Huntington at Harvard, in his book, Who Are We?, is essentially an understanding of the American creed as being cultural. It understands America as being largely Anglo, meaning of British origins, Protestant, and dominated by the English language. It is understood, in other words, that what the essence of America is very, not just European-oriented, but Anglo-oriented in terms of British origins. It very much has to do with respect and prominence of the Protestant faith within our Christian faith, and very much focuses upon the English language. This sort of a view, one can interpret it as being largely hegemonic, that is, you have to fit in this way, otherwise you're not going to fit in whatsoever. Requiring assimilation, that is, you have to fit into this mainstream if you're going to be American, and it's very difficult to change. That's what I mean by object. Very difficult to change and to modify. There is another interpretation of what the American creed might be and what the essence of the American creed might be. And to give us an opportunity to think this through, I want to take from some recent writing of recently deceased a prominent American historian, Arthur Schlesinger Jr., who suggests that what makes the American creed different and essential is not so much its cultural origins. Of course there's a cultural background and a cultural origin to the country. You can't talk about the United States without talking about our British origins and the dominance of Protestantism as a part of defining the nature of essential elements of understanding of liberty in the United States. But what makes this critical is the extent to which anyone could become American by committing themselves to democratic values of participation, tolerance, and conflict resolution. That's the genius of what the American creed is in his interpretation and in his view. A view that I would suggest is much more inclusive, pluralistic, or evolutionary, allowing for others to come through. Well, how do we reconcile these two different perspectives of what the American creed is? How have we as a nation reconciled these two differences? One way to understand it that I find convincing and that I think is very helpful to us in considering the current challenges we face regarding continued and growing immigration from Mexico and other countries in the United States is to look to the work of a political theorist, Roger Smith, in his book Civic Ideals, where he talks about the United States being characterized by multiple traditions and civic myths. Very quickly, let me describe for you what he understands those traditional civic myths to be. And don't misunderstand myths here. By myths, he means ideas, not necessarily lies. He says there are at least three, at least as I read him, there are three. One, individual liberalism. This is the respect for the individual and respect for individual property rights. I think we would all agree that's an essential part of what America and American identity is. A second is what I recast from his writing as civic republicanism. The idea that it's okay to sacrifice your individual interest for a larger common good. That is, the fact that another part of American tradition, in addition to respect for the individual and the implications for limited government, in addition to the need for individual rights to be respected, is that individuals can choose in certain circumstances to sacrifice those individual rights for a larger common good, and maybe it is even required of Americans at particular points in time. But the third and most complex point that he makes, and the one that I think is most essential and critical, is ascriptive inegalitarianism, a term that only a political theorist could love, except for perhaps a literary theorist who would find it a bit sophomoric in some ways. But ascriptive inegalitarianism is simply this idea: the reconciliation between respect for individual rights and the building of community, which I would characterize this as capturing civic republicanism. The balance between the two is determined on the basis of who we define to be part of our community and who we define out. Ascriptive inegalitarianism suggests that we have a foundational tradition of growing as an inclusive community on the basis of bringing new people in, but we've never brought everybody in at the same time. In other words, to bring more people in, to extend voting rights to more, to extend legal property rights to more people, in order to be able to bring in more distinct segments of our population, including immigrants, we have a long tradition of making sure that everyone was not included. African Americans for a long time were not included. Even after the Civil War, African Americans were defined out again. Women were included not until 1920. Progressive reforms, a whole set of issues, and immigrant understandings of immigrants' citizenship rights and opportunities have always been understood partially in terms of who was in and who was out. That's how we attained the balance. Why is this important for us? Two more comments I want to make. Why is this important for us to understand our current immigration policy? We are at a strategic moment in time where we are trying to attain what that new balance is. We are at a point in time where we are being required to define it. Now, how do we get this balance? How do we come to understand this balance? How do we come to understand Mexican immigration? And how does Mexican immigration help us understand that balance? Again, Professor Smith is useful here. That balance is provided to us by political leaders who use their interpretations of that balance to garner support in a democratic regime, to allow then for the policies to be enacted to justify whatever set of choices we make as voters in deciding how it is that we want to support the options that we have. It is a democratic way of deciding who's included in the community and who's not. Now, who are these Latino immigrants? Who are these Mexican immigrants? What special challenges do they present to the United States? My colleague Gary Segura is going to talk about important data we have on their attitudes and predispositions. Let me very briefly show you two quick slides that help us provide further context for understanding the nature of these attitudes and values. One is a slide that I hope is back there that looks at population shifts and predicted population shifts in the United States. Notice the line going down. That's European Americans, whites, choose your preferred term. The line going up, particularly the highest line going up, is Latinos. The United States is changing, as it may change in the future. Now, we've had a discussion already about how changes in immigration laws and population shifts in Mexico would imply that. My point here is simply to use this chart, not to say this is what's going to happen. My point here is to say this is what many of us think may happen and drives particularly important nationalistic claims. But it's not just a question of speculating what may happen in terms of Latino population growth, driven in part by immigration. There is a reality that was also described as well. The percent Hispanic change that occurred between 1990 and 2000, as the chart behind me indicates, shows that it is largely in states without histories of strong Mexican and Latino immigration that experienced the largest, not absolute change, but percentage change in their Latino population. There's a way in which more Americans are being required to decide what the balance will be between who is part of the community and who's not, and what sacrifices we might be willing to make regarding our individual interests more communities are required to confront that directly than has ever been the case, perhaps, in the past.
So I get to tell you a little bit about what the data suggest on 3 interesting dimensions of this. And the first I'm going to talk about is assimilation. One of the key indicators of assimilation, and one of the indicators that most draws the attention of both proponents and opponents of immigration, is language proficiency. And so I'm going to show you a little bit of data taken from the Latino National Survey. And what these data suggest is that the acquisition of English by Latin American migrants, including Mexicans, is approximately the same as the acquisition of English was by European migrants in the latter part of the 19th and the early part of the 20th century. If there's a distinction, it is that the retention of Spanish language ability continues in meaningful levels up through the 4th generation, so that as much as 60% of our respondents indicate that they are still able to speak some Spanish. But the important point is that English proficiency jumps above 90% in the first generation born in the United States and approximates universal English competency in subsequent generations. More importantly, these immigrants feel that it is important to learn English. So this notion that Latin American immigrants, Mexican immigrants are not interested in learning English is just simply not true. Somewhere between somewhere in the neighborhood of 99% of each generation feels that it is somewhat or very important to learn English. Again, there is still an interest in maintaining the cultural ability, the cultural marker of Spanish speaking, but the commitment of immigrants to learn English, their own reported feelings, suggest that there's uniform enthusiasm. There are a number of other markers of social assimilation that are not language-oriented, and on the screen behind you, I hope, is a list of several of them. The first is religious identity. Roman Catholicism is the dominant religious identity of most of the Latin American migrants, but that declines rather significantly across generation, something I'm sure that would make Huntington pleased. Social capital participation, meaning that individuals join civic and social organizations or political organizations, increases, and by the 3rd and 4th generation approximates rates similar to those of the rest of the society. Military service, either the individual serving or an immediate member of their family serving, not only goes up, it goes up quite highly. And one of the striking results we found in the Latino National Survey is the proximity to military service from very large percentages of our sample. And people who drop out of high school, low rates of educational attainment are, of course, deeply problematic for immigrant populations. Again, high school dropout percentages decline rather significantly across generation. Household income, the percentage of individuals who earn more than $35,000 a year that earn less than $35,000 a year goes down. But it doesn't go down as quickly or as significantly as we might hope. So there's still a question of social mobility. And then the percentage of out-group marriage, which has often been used as an indicator of social assimilation, the percentage of out-group marriage is actually quite high among Latinos, especially as generations increase. One important question we asked in the survey is the degree to which Latinos should change to blend into the larger society, or Latinos should endeavor to maintain a distinct culture in the United States. Oddly, we have positive relationships between those two variables, which suggests that people can simultaneously tell you that they do believe blending in is important, and they believe retaining an Hispanic cultural identity is important, and that those two things are not seen as either-or propositions. An important element that we often look at is the expression of values. That is, going back to one of Luis's slides, do the migrants express political values that we would find broadly consistent with commitment to principles that we would call American? The first is the notion we asked the respondents about the equality of rights. Should individuals have the same rights regardless of their political beliefs? Widespread agreement on this, and an agreement that increases across generations. Individual responsibility, the idea that your life outcomes are largely driven by your own industry and your own skills and not the fault of some system. So this is the self-reliance notion that we frequently hear in discussion of American values. Again, a very large percentage, in the 70% range, frequently, or 70 to 80% range, frequently identify life's outcomes as being driven primarily by their own industry. So there is a strong commitment to self-reliance. Curiously, however, the proportion who just somewhat agree with that statement rather than strongly agree goes up across generations, so that over the course of time, Latinos in the United States appear to understand that there are obstacles in the society that may not entirely be driven by individual industry. Finally, equal opportunity. Is it a problem if people have uneven life chances? And by the fourth generation, over half of our respondents strongly or somewhat disagree that people having unequal chances in life is not a problem. They actually think that structural inequality is a problem. That's something that's learned over the course of generations. I want to turn my attention now to the economic dimensions of immigration, and this is, without a doubt, some of the more controversial aspects of the immigration debate and the ones that promote a significant amount of the opposition to immigration. Does immigration increase American unemployment and lower wages? There's a lot of debate about this, but at least if you take the preponderance of the evidence, the answer appears to be no. And I'm going to quote from a policy report from a famous left-wing institute called the Cato Institute, where in looking at the preponderance of evidence across multiple studies, they conclude immigrants have practically no negative effect in the labor market on any person except other immigrants. The effect on wages is modest by any appraisal, and the effect on unemployment is apparently zero. And you might be thinking, how can this be so? We introduce new people to the labor markets. Clearly, this should have some sort of spillover effect. There are a couple of reasons in the literature that suggest that this spillover effect is modest, if not non-existent. This is not to say that there aren't local dislocations, just that there is not a national major problem. The first is that immigrant employment delays the overseas movement of jobs. That is, some manufacturing jobs that would have been moved offshore remain in the context of in the physical United States, in part because there's labor available to fill those jobs. The second is that immigrant employment is concentrated in sectors with declining interest from U.S. labor force. There is remarkably little interest in farm labor, for example, from U.S.-born citizens. Immigration creates excess demand. That is, immigrants themselves become consumers, and in many ways quite voracious consumers, as their standard of living goes up. And finally, immigration increasingly feeds the labor movement. That is, rather than compete with organized labor, immigrants have become an important new source of potential recruits to the various unions. Do immigrants grow the economy? The answer to this is possibly. European Union nations have experienced substantial economic shocks from stable or decreasing populations. Market shrinkages and labor shortages combine to cause significant economic dislocation. Immigrants help retain labor-intensive industries within the United States. And more importantly, and a point that was made in yesterday evening's presentation, if native population growth and improvements in productivity do not keep pace with demand, inflationary pressures and reduced GDP growth may result. The figure we heard presented last night is that approximately 86% of the growth in the U.S. workforce has come through immigration. That is, our economy has grown far more quickly than our native-born population can support. If you look at this graph behind me, what you see, and unfortunately the markers of the years have gone away, but this is 1990 to 2006, and what you look at is the rate of unemployment over time. And the second line from the bottom is the 5% line. I can't even see it on the graph. Sorry about that. But essentially, if you look about two-thirds of the way down, that's the 5% mark. Economists identify 5% as the level of frictional and structural unemployment that you're likely to observe in any economy, even when everything is going great. That is, people change jobs, one plant closes, a new plant opens, etc. So at any period of time, some percentage of the population is unemployed. There is some evidence that the rate of frictional and structural unemployment is actually somewhat higher than 5%. It's actually 6% because of the pace of technological innovation and the frequency of career change and modernity. It turns out that every time you see very low dips in the unemployment rate, those create either inflationary pressures or depress growth in GDP. During this period of time of rapid immigrant growth, we have had remarkably low, stable unemployment rates in the United States. So finally, ending my discussion of the economy, immigration scholars usually identify factors of push and pull. NAFTA caused changes to the Mexican economy that appear to have hastened the push, and we're going to hear more about that, I'm sure, this afternoon. But modernization has caused significant rural displacement. As the Mexican economy modernizes, it causes unemployment in rural areas. It is important to recall that nearly all immigrants work for U.S. citizens. It is not the case that immigrants come to the United States and work for other immigrants. So as a lot of anger is directed towards immigrant populations, it's important to remember that the current structure of immigration policy and the current arrangement benefits someone. In any political status quo, there are forces in the society that benefit from that status quo. Remittances account for approximately $20 billion of foreign revenue to the Mexican economy and are critical to that economy. If those remittances were to go away, we might actually increase the rate of Mexican migration to the United States. Various Supreme Court decisions and other regulatory regimes have actually created incentives in the United States for employers to hire undocumented aliens. And those would have to be addressed if we want to take a serious effort at reducing migration. The case of Hoffman Plastics versus the National Labor Relations Board is one example where the Supreme Court essentially said that undocumented laborers are alien from our federal workplace protection policies, whether that be occupational safety and health, labor laws, etc. So in terms of the economic forces that drive immigrants from their home, most of those forces occur in a way that the immigrants themselves have very little control over. And finally, I want to talk about politics. I am, after all, a political scientist.
We're not expressing a preference here at all regarding.
Yes, this is not an endorsement or a prediction, but it certainly reflects current poll numbers. And it turns out it's remarkably difficult to find good pictures on the web. But anyway, so the politics of immigration, there is a remarkable consensus among the American population on immigration. And what's interesting about this is that you hear in the news all the time that it's a deeply divisive subject in the United States. Approximately 63% of the American public favor a multifaceted approach, one that ramps up enforcement, border control, and regularizes the status of immigrants here in the United States. It is difficult in the United States to find a 63% agreement on any issue, let alone one as contentious as immigration, and yet the media will portray this as there not being a consensus. Now, there are key distinctions between primary and general election constituencies, and therein lies the rub. Anti-immigrant stands play very well in GOP primaries because GOP primary constituencies, on the whole, tend to reflect more anti-immigrant tendencies than Democratic constituencies. This may not serve them well in the general election. There was a very interesting op-ed in the New York Times the other day by Linda Chavez, where she suggested that it was precisely these vehement anti-immigration stance that cost the GOP at least 3 seats in the Intermountain West, and I'll talk about that in just a moment. The GOP itself, of course, is internally divided. In my own state of Washington, there are lots of apple farmers watching fruit rot on their trees. Apple farmers are not a heavily Democratic lot by chance, but they are very much in favor of immigration reform because they lack the employees necessary to harvest the fruit. There are long-term and electoral college effects of this politics of immigration. 85.6% of all Latinos under the age of 18 in the United States are born citizens of this country. That's from the census. This means, if you're doing the math, that the Latino electorate will approximately double in the next 2 decades without a single additional immigrant entering the United States or naturalizing to U.S. citizenship. Recall that most Latinos are within a single generation of the immigrant experience. Approximately 87% of all Latinos have either one parent or one grandparent who is foreign born. The GOP then may have killed itself for a generation with Latino voters, and by the way, that phrase comes from a GOP internal document. Polls of Latino voters show overwhelming support for less punitive and more comprehensive reform measures. Since Proposition 187 in California, Latino public opinion has generally drawn few distinctions between politics targeting immigrants and politics targeting Latinos in general. And that impact is most likely to be felt in the intermountain states of Nevada, Colorado, Arizona, and New Mexico, where I would argue, and where my good buddy Tom Schaller in his book Whistling Past Dixie has argued, where the next several presidential elections will be decided. If you look at this chart, you see Latino immigration preferences by generation. The overwhelming preference of all generations is a guest worker program that leads to legalization, that leads to normalization, an earned citizenship process. Among the first generation, their preference is amnesty. The guest worker program that leads to no change of status is not wildly popular, and the seal the border, throw everyone out strategy, as you can imagine, is not particularly popular. I'm going to close with a visual from a political commercial that was on the web. This political commercial was run by the Republicans against incumbent Senator Debbie Stabenow in Michigan. To a series of pointed questions about immigration, Debbie Stabenow on the website would reply, "No problema," in a phony accent, and then the sombrero would bounce on her head. It is difficult to interpret such political messages as anything other than, at the very least, culturally insensitive, but in fact I would use the R word. So in summary, immigration is a long-standing source of national hand-wringing. Immigration needs to be understood within the context of competing traditions of what constitutes Americanness. Essential or not, Latino immigrants imbibe many of those traits to surprising degrees. The economic forces shaping immigration need to be understood and addressed if change is desired or to be accomplished. The politics of immigration is fraught with complexity and potential pitfalls for both political parties.
Thank you so much.